Hey everybody, Aaron Mac BS Detector. I'm going to try to continue to read here, and God willing, I turned my phone off, I turned it back on, I've offloaded so many apps. Anyways, we're going to keep exposing these J's, all right? I was on Facebook and it made me feel so happy because there was like a younger black girl, and she's like realizing, yes, these people are evil and they are the true white supremacists. While they claim that they're quote unquote Jayish, which is a freaking religion, they are from Eastern Europe. So I'm so happy to see people waking up, dude. It's making me so happy. And that's the whole thing too, is this whole racial divide and conquer tactic was created by them. And a lot of this book goes into exposing that and exposing other things of like how they have subverted Western Christendom. Okay. And whether you're a Christian or not, you cannot say that, uh, you know, uh, Christian-based societies are high trust societies. Okay, I've been watching all these videos of like all the Europeans that have come over to America for the World Cup, and they are so astounded that a woman can walk down the street in broad freaking daylight with an expensive purse without being robbed. And that's because mass migration, which is what? A Jayish freaking idea and tactic. They want to flood all of white Christian societies with low IQ, third world people, regardless of their color. Like, nobody gives a shit about anybody's color, okay? That's not what it's about. It's about your culture. Some cultures are better than others. They just are. That's just a fact. Otherwise, if they were all the same, why is everyone trying so hard to get into America? And all you America-hating people are really freaking ungrateful. I don't want to say a coworker. It's kind of loosely a coworker, not really, just kind of like an independent contractor, made some little side comment about being black in America. And I'm like, yeah, you got it pretty good, right? Like, like, what does that even mean? Like, literally has it so freaking good, has nicer clothes than I do, probably drives a nicer car than I do, probably has a nicer place than I do, and it's complaining. Like, make it make sense. Anyways, it's just that attitude. It's this victimhood mentality that these Jays have started and have pushed on to and brainwashed all of the black people into thinking that they are victims too. Nobody is a victim here in America. Okay. This is the land of opportunity, even though it's getting shittier and shittier by the day. Nobody's a victim here. All right. This Marxist brainwash that everyone's been getting for, I don't know, the past 20 years or so is what has got everybody being ungrateful. I just saw some lady that literally was like, food and water is a human right. It's like, water, sure, but you still have to get up and go work for your food. Even in like medieval times, ancient times, the men went out and hunted, came back, and the men and the women would, gut the animal, strip it of its skin, and then they'd have to cook it. That is so labor intensive. And if you don't work, you don't eat. So this whole gimme, gimme, gimme handout mentality is like, I'm over it. Anyways, I don't know exactly where the video cut me off at, so I'm going to start at section 6 of chapter, I think it's 5, which is titled The Exodus. Not talking about the biblical one, by the way. Okay. So much for size, but what do we know of the social structure and composition of the Khazar immigrant community? First, the first impression one gains is a striking similarity between certain privileged positions held by Khazar Jews in Hungary and in Poland in those early days. Both the Hungarian and Polish sources refer to Jews employed as mint masters, administrators of the royal revenue, controllers of the salt monopoly, tax collectors, and, quote, money lenders, i.e. bankers. This parallel suggests a common origin of those two immigrant communities, and as we can trace the origins of the bulk Hungarian Uri to the Magyar-Khazar nexus, the conclusion seems self-evident. The early records reflect the part played by immigrant Jews in the two countries' budding economic life. That it was an important part is not surprising, since foreign trade and the levying of customs duties had been the Khazars' principal source of income in the past. Yeah, that's how they earn all their money. Taxes and usury. They have never created anything. They just steal other people's ideas and act like, Albert Einstein was the smartest guy ever. He was a freaking idiot. Savant was what he was. Like, he was great at math. Cool. That doesn't mean anything. Anyways, early records reflect the part played by immigrant Jews in the two countries' building economic life. That it was an important part is not surprising, since foreign trade and the levying of customs duties had been the Khazars' principal. Okay, already read that. Yeah, that's literally how they have made their income going back hundreds of years, is just charging people like a tax on things. They are the original tax collectors, okay? Which are some of the most disgusting people on the face of the earth. They had the experience which their new hosts were lacking, and it was only logical that they were called in to advise and participate in the management of the finances of court and nobility. The coins minted in the 12th and 13th centuries with Polish inscriptions in, quote, Hebrew lettering, chapter 2, okay, that's in parentheses, are somewhat bizarre relics of these activities. The exact purpose they served is still something of a mystery. I think that the purpose that they serve is for them to create some sort of false history to legitimize their bullshit claim that they are ancient Hebrews. Okay? These Dead Sea Scrolls, people are like legit taking them so seriously. It's like, those were planted. Like, be so for real. And it was like they were like miraculously found like a year before the formation of the Zionist state of Israel. Like, let's turn our BS detectors on, everybody, okay? Let's learn to like detect the BS when it's right in front of our face. Okay. The exact purpose they served is still something of a mystery. Yeah. I think I know what the purpose that they served is, but, some bear the name of a king, for example, Lezek or Miezko. Others are inscribed, quote, from the house of Abraham ben Joseph the Prince, end quote, possibly the mentor banker himself, or show just a word of benediction, quote, luck, or, quote, blessing. Significantly contemporary Hungarian forces also speak of the practice of minting coins from silver provided by Jewish owners. However, in contrast to Western Europe, finance and commerce were far from being the only fields of Jewish activity. Some rich immigrants became landowners in Poland, as Count Tika was in Hungary. Jewish landholdings comprising a whole village of Jewish farmers are recorded, for instance, in the vicinity of Breslau before 1203, and in the early days there must have been Khazar peasants in considerable numbers, as the ancient Khazar place names seem to indicate. A tantalizing glimpse of how some of these villages may have come into being is provided by the Karaite records mentioned before. They relate how Prince Witold settled a group of Karaite prisoners of war in Krasna, providing them with houses, orchards, and a land to a distance of 1.5 miles. Krasna has been tentatively identified with the Jewish small town of Krasnoya in Podolia. But farming did not hold out a future for the Jewish community. Of course not. There were several reasons for this. The rise of feudalism in the 14th century gradually transformed the peasants of Poland into serfs, forbidden to leave their villages, deprived of freedom of movement. At the same time, under the joint pressure of the ecclesiastic hierarchy and the feudal landlords, the Polish parliament in 1496 forbade the acquisition of agricultural land by Jays. But the process of alienation from the soil must have started long before that. Apart from the specific causes just mentioned, religious discrimination combined with the degradation of the free peasants into serfs, the transformation of the predominantly agricultural nation of Khazars into a predominantly urban community reflected a common phenomenon in the history of migrations. Faced with different climatic conditions and farming methods on the one hand, and on the other, with unexpected opportunities for an easier living offered by urban civilization, immigration population were apt to change their occupational structure within a few generations. The offspring of Abruzzi peasants in the New World became waiters and restaurateurs. The grandsons of Polish farmers may become engineers or psychoanalysts. Yeah, that's what we need. More freaking Jewish psychoanalysts telling us, you know, how everything is related to sex and all their weird sexual shit. The opposite process of colonists settling on virgin soil applies to migrants from more highly developed to underdeveloped regions. And it's funny to me that even this author acts like he just doesn't understand, why the Jays would be treated the way that they're treated. It's because of their secrecy, their supremacist ideologies, and their, they're almost like Freemasons in that it is a very closed group. No outsiders are welcome to join. Okay. And they've had a lot of time to plot and scheme. Okay, however, the transformation of Khazar J. Uri into Polish J. Uri did not entail any brutal break with the past or loss of identity. It was a gradual, organic process of change, which, as Polyak has convincingly shown, preserved some vital traditions of Khazar communal life in their new country. This was mainly achieved through the emergence of a social structure or way of life found nowhere else in the world diaspora. The Jayish small town in Hebrew, Ayara, in Yiddish, shtetl, in Polish, miasteczko. All three designations are diminutives, which, however, do not necessarily refer to smallness and size. Some were quite big, small towns, but to the limited rights of municipal self-government they enjoyed. The shtetl could not be confused with the ghetto. The latter consisted of a street or quarter in which Jews were compelled to live within the confines of a Gentile town. Oh. It was from the second half of the 16th century onward the universal habitat of Jews everywhere in the Christian and most of the Muslim world. The ghetto was surrounded by walls with gates that were locked at night. It gave rise to claustrophobia and mental inbreeding, but also to a sense of relative security in times of trouble. He admitted this literally in like a couple of paragraphs ago that these were self-imposed segregations. Like they wanted these segregations. They act like they were the victims of discrimination when they were the ones discriminating against everyone else. And they were the ones that were the supremacists and they wanted to be off to themselves. Okay. So let's recognize that BS. All right. It was for the second half of the 16th century onward the universal habitat of Jews everywhere in the Christian. Okay, as it could not expand in size, the houses were tall and narrow-chested, and permanent overcrowding created deplorable sanitary conditions. It took great spiritual strength for people living in such circumstances to keep their self-respect. Not all of them did. And this is when, the smallest violin busts out and starts playing My Heart Bleeds for You. Hold on, I gotta let the dog out. Okay, so, and I know she's going to be back scratching on the door any minute now, but she's just going to have to chill. Okay. Okay. The shtetl, on the other hand, was a quite different proposition, a type of settlement which, as already said, existed only in Poland, Lithuania, and nowhere else in the world. It was a self-contained country town with an exclusively or predominantly Jewish population. The shtetl's origins probably date back to the 13th century and may represent the missing link, as it were, between the market towns of Khazaria and the Jewish settlements in Poland. The economic and social function of these semi-rural, semi-urban agglomerations seems to have been similar in both countries. In Khazaria, as later in Poland, they provided a network of trading posts or market towns which mediated between the needs of the big towns and the countryside. They had regular fairs at which sheep and cattle, alongside the goods manufactured in the towns and the products of the rural cottage industries, were sold or bartered. At the same time, they were centers where artisans plied their crafts, from wheelwrights to blacksmiths, silversmiths, tailors, kosher butchers, millers, bakers, and candlestick makers. There were also letter writers for the illiterate, synagogues for the faithful, inns for travelers, and a heder, or heater, which is a Hebrew for, quote, room. And really, it's actually probably Yiddish for room, because let's be so for real. None of this is Hebrew. I don't know that even the Hebrew language even ever really existed. Like the more I'm looking into it, the more that I find that like it probably didn't. Okay. Um, okay, Hebrew for quote room, which served as a school. There were itinerant storytellers and folk bards. Some of their names, such as Velvel Zbarzer, have been preserved. 25 traveling from shtetl to shtetl in Poland, and no doubt earlier on in Khazaria, if one is to judge by the survival of storytellers among Oriental people to our day. Oriental. They're fucking white people, bro. Some particular trades became virtually a Jewish monopoly in Poland. One was dealing in timber, which reminds one that timber was the chief building material and an important export in Khazaria. Another was transport. Quote, the dense net of shuttles, quote, writes Polyak, quote, made it possible to distribute manufactured goods over the whole country by means of the superbly built, superbly built Jayish type of horse cart. The preponderance of this kind of transport, especially in the east of the country, was so marked, amounting to a virtual monopoly, that the quote Hebrew word for carter, Baal Agala, which literally means master of the cart, Baal means master. Just saying. Was incorporated into the Russian language as Balagula. Only the development of the railway in the second half of the 19th century led to a decline in this trade, end quote. Now, the specialization in coach building and cartering could certainly not have developed in the closed ghettos of western Uri. It unmistakably points to a Khazar origin. The people of the ghettos were sedentary, while the Khazars, like other semi-nomadic people, used horse or ox-drawn carts to transport their tents, goods, and chattel, including royal tents the size of a circus, fit to accommodate several hundred people. They certainly had the know-how to negotiate the roughest tracks in their new country. Other specifically Jewish occupations were innkeeping, the running of flour mills, and trading in furs, none of them found in the ghettos of Western Europe. Such, in broad outlines, was the structure of the Jewish shtetl in Poland. Some of its features could be found in old market towns in any country. Others show a more specific affinity with what we know, little though it is, about townships of Khazaria, which were probably the prototypes of the Polish shtetl. To these specific features should be added the, quote, pagoda style of the oldest surviving wooden shtetl synagogues dating from the 15th and 16th centuries, which is totally different from both the native style of architecture and from the building style adopted by Western Jews and replicated later on in the ghettos of Poland. The interior decoration of the oldest shtetl synagogues is also quite different from the style of the Western ghetto. The walls of the shtetl synagogue were covered with Moorish arabesques and with animal figures characteristic of the Persian influence found in Magyar Khazar artifacts, and in the decorative style brought to Poland by Armenian immigrants. The traditional garb of Polish Uri is also of unmistakably Eastern origin. The typical long silk kaftan may have been an imitation of the coat worn by the Polish nobility, which itself was copied from the outfit of the Mongols in the Golden Horde. Fashions travel across political divisions, but we know that kaftans were worn long before that by the nomads of the steppes. The skull cap, or the yarmulke, is worn to this day by Orthodox Jays and by the Uzbeks and other Turkish people in the Soviet Union. And also by the Pope when he's not wearing his Dagon hat. On top of the skull cap, men wore the strimal, an elaborate round that rimmed with fox fur, which the Khazars copied from the Cossacks, or vice versa. I was going to say that sounded like the Russian hat. As already mentioned, the trade in fox and sable furs, which had been flourishing in Khazaria, became another virtual Jewish monopoly in Poland. As for the women, they wore until the middle of the 19th century a tall white turban, which was an exact copy of the jaluk worn by Cossack and Turkmen women. Nowadays, Orthodox Jewesses have to wear, instead of a turban, a wig made of their own hair, which is shaved off when they get married. That's so fucking weird, dude. One Night also mentions in this context, though somewhat dubiously, the Polish Jews' odd passion for gefilte fish, a national dish which the Polish Gentiles adopted. Quote, without fish, the saying went, there is no Sabbath, end quote. Was it derived from distant memories of life on the Caspian, where fish was the staple diet? Life in the shuttle is celebrated with much romantic nostalgia and Jayish literature and folklore. Yeah, it is, because they romanticize a whole fiction. I mean, like, I'm sure some of what they're saying is true, but like, I mean, look at Hollywood. They make up stories. They propaganda. They created propaganda. Okay, Edward Bernays was a Jew. They created modern psychiatry. Freud was a Jew. Communism, Marx, Jew. I mean, they're all of them. And it is a big club, and we're not in it. And even the famous comedian Jew George Carlin said that himself. So this is what I find interesting, is that their own people, it be their own people that put them on Front Street. And I don't know whether they realize what they're exposing in themselves, if it's a controlled expose. I'm not really sure. I don't care though. Like, people need to know this shit. All right. Okay, so wherever one is, he will try to reach home in time to greet the Sabbath with his own family. The peddler traveling from village to village, the itinerant tailor, shoemaker, cobbler, the merchant off on a trip, all will plan, push, hurry, trying to reach home before sunset on Friday evening. As they press homeward, the shamus calls through the streets of the shuttle, quote, Jews to the bathhouse, end quote, a functionary of the synagogue. The shamus is a combination of sexton and beadle. He speaks with the authority more of his own, for when he calls, quote, Jews to the bathhouse, he is summoning them to a commandment. The most vivid evocation of a life in the shuttle is the surrealistic amalgam of fact and fantasy. Fact and fantasy. In the paintings and lithographs of Marc Chagall, where biblical symbols appear side by side with bearded carter wielding his whip and wistful rabbis in kaftan and yarmulke. It was a weird community reflecting its weird origins. Yeah, bro, like, so weird. Earliest small towns were probably founded by prisoners of war, such as the Karaites of Troki, from Polish and Lithuanian nobles who were anxious to settle on their empty lands. But the majority of these settlements were products of a general migration away from the, quote, wild fields, which were turning into deserts. After the Mongol conquest, wrote Polyak, when the Slav villages wandered westward, the Khazar shuttles went with them. The pioneers of the new settlements were probably rich Khazar traders who constantly traveled across Poland on the much frequent trade routes into Hungary. The Magyar and Kabar migration into Hungary blazed the trail for the growing Khazar settlement in Poland. It turned Poland into a transit area between the two countries with Jewish communities. Thus, the traveling merchants were familiar with conditions in the prospective areas of resettlement and had occasion to make contact with the landowners in search of tenants. The landlord could enter into an agreement with such rich and respected Jews, end quote. We're reminded of Abraham Prokofnik, quote, as would settle on his estate and bring in other settlers. They would, as a rule, choose people from the place where they had lived, end quote. These colonists would be an assorted lot of farmers, artisans, and craftsmen, forming a more or less self-supporting community. Thus, the Khazar shuttle would be transplanted and become a Polish shuttle. Farming would gradually drop out, but by that time the adaptation to changed conditions would have been completed. The nucleus of modern Jait Uri thus followed the old recipe. Strike out for new horizons, but stick together, and that they have done. Okay, chapter 6. Where from? Section 1. Two basic facts emerge from our survey. The disappearance of the Khazar nation from its historic habitat. Yeah, because they had to turn into, Jews. They had to turn into God's chosen people, baby. So they didn't disappear. They just made up a whole nother history that, they're ancient people of the book, and they're not. I hope that this is making sense to you guys. Okay. The disappearance of the Khazar nation from its historic habitat and the simultaneous appearance in adjacent regions to the northwest of the greatest concentration of Jews since the beginning of the diaspora. And this diaspora is not the real one of the Hebrews. And this is what they do. Okay? They create a parallel narrative. Okay? Just like they've created this Hebrew 2.0 language to try and legitimize themselves and make themselves seem like they are the people of the Old Testament. They are not, bro. So it just makes it so confusing. And if you go and watch Ben Born Again, he lets you know about the word, the word and the name games they play, okay? Because this is what they do. And, God is not the author of confusion. These people are, though, because they're the devil's children. Okay. Since the two are obviously connected, they're not, though. They're not obviously connected at all. Historians agree that the immigration from Khazaria must have contributed to the growth of Polish Jewry, a conclusion supported by the evidence cited in the previous chapters, but they feel less certain about the extent of this contribution. The size of the Khazar immigration compared with the influx of Western Jews and their respective share in the genetic makeup of the modern Jewish community. In other words, the fact that Khazars immigrated in substantial numbers into Poland is established beyond dispute. The question is whether they provided the bulk of the new settlement or only its hardcore, as it were. To find the answer to this question, we must get some idea of the size of the immigration of, quote, real Jews from the West. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. This is section 2. Towards the end of the first millennium, the most important settlements of Western European Jews were in France and the Rhineland, which is Germany. It says, not counting the Jays of Spain, who formed a category apart and did not participate in the migratory movements with which we are concerned. And I think that's the Sephardi's. Some of these communities had probably been found in Roman days, for between the destruction of Jerusalem and the decline of the Roman Empire, Jays had settled in many of the greater cities under its rule and were later on reinforced by immigrants from Italy and North Africa. Thus, we have records from the 9th century onwards of Jewish communities in places all over France. Why? Why did it take 900 years? Why did it take 900 years? Because it seems to me, the Jewish and Roman battle in the 1st century, that was like the end of days that the Bible talks about. I'm pretty sure Jesus returned, set up his millennial kingdom. And so I just think it's very interesting that it's like these people, they just pop up out of nowhere like 800-900 years later, claiming to be ancient Hebrews from the Bible and demanding that we all give them that title and that we also follow their sick, futurist, eschatological, psychotic, supremacist ideology. And they've brainwashed a lot of the church to do it also, which really bothers me, but I digress. Anyways, okay. Okay. So, between the destruction of Jerusalem and the decline of the Roman Empire, Jews had settled in many of the greater cities under its rule and were later on reinforced by immigrants from Italy and North Africa. Thus, we have records from the 9th century onwards of Jewish communities in places all over France, from Normandy down to Provence and the Mediterranean. One group even crossed the Channel to England in the wake of the Norman invasion, apparently invited by William the Conqueror because he needed their capital and enterprise. Their history has been summed up by Barron. They were subsequently converted into a class of royal usurers. Inbreeding royal usurers, okay? The monarchy over there, they are of the same Turkic Mongol descendants, I'm pretty sure. Anyways, whose main function was to provide credits for both political and economic ventures. Nothing has changed. They're still funding wars. They're still buying politicians. This is what they do. After accumulating great wealth through the high rate of interest, which is forbidden in the Torah, by the way, these moneylenders were forced to disgorge it in one form or another for the benefit of the royal treasury. The prolonged well-being of many Jewish families, the splendor of their residence and attire, and their influence on public affairs blinded even experienced observers to the deep dangers lurking from the growing resentment of debtors of all classes and the exclusive dependence of Jews on the protection of their royal masters. Rumblings of discontent culminating in violent outbreaks in 1189 through 1190 presaged the final tragedy, the expulsion of 1290. Yeah, this is what they've done. They have gone all over the freaking world, and they have used their usury to drain the wealth of nations And then when the people realize they've been had, they get mad and they put them out. This is the exact same thing that happened in Germany, except to top that all off, they were going in hard with, their subversion of the Christian culture and all the gay shit and all the trans shit. So when you see the video of them burning books, you think, oh my God, how dare they? No, they were burning filth. They were burning pornography. They were burning sexual subversive content. Okay. Okay. Rumblings of discontent culminating in violent outbreaks in 1189 through 1190 presaged the final tragedy, the expulsion of 1290. The meteoric rise and even more rapid decline of English Jewry in the brief span of 2.25 centuries, 1066 through 1290, brought into sharp relief the fundamental factors shaping the destinies of all Western Jewries in the crucial first half of the second millennium. The English example is instructive because it is an exceptionally well documented compared to the early history of the Jewish communities on the continent. The main lesson we derive from it is that the social economic influence of the Jews was quite out of proportion with their small numbers. And it still is today. They're like literally 5% of the population, and yet they control essentially the world's economy through their fiat banking system. And it's fiat because it's backed by nothing, because they have sucked all the wealth out of it. When we were at least on the gold standard, our money was worth something. Now it's worth nothing. They have totally sucked all of the wealth out of this country, out of all of Europe, and now they're flooding us with third world, low IQ migrants. This is what they do. It's a pattern that you will start to recognize the more you read about them. Okay. There were apparently no more than 2,500 Jews in England at any time before their expulsion in 1290. According to the classic survey of Joseph Jacobs, the Jew of Angevin, England, based on recorded Jewish family names and their documents. This tiny Jewish community in medieval England played a leading part in the country's economic establishment, much more so than its opposite number in Poland. Yet in contrast to Poland, it could not rely on a network of Jewish small towns to provide it with a mass basis of humble craftsmen, of lower middle class artisans and workmen, carters and innkeepers. It had no roots in the people. On this vital issue, Angevin, England, epitomized developments on the Western continent. The Jews of France and Germany faced the same predicament. Their occupational stratification was lopsided and top-heavy. This led everywhere to the same tragic sequence of events. It's not tragic. It's FAFO. Fuck around and find out. The dreary tale always starts with a honeymoon and ends in a divorce and bloodshed. In the beginning, the Jews were pampered with special charters, privileges, favors. They are persona grata, like the court alchemists, because they alone have the secret of how to keep the wheels of the economy turning. Quote, in the Dark Ages, end quote, wrote Cecil Roth, quote, the commerce of Western Europe was largely in Jewish hands, not excluding the slave trade. Okay, they want to blame all of this shit on Western Europeans owning slaves. No. 90, like something like 90, this is a number you have to check. It's between 95 and 98% of all slave ships were owned by Jews. That's a fact, baby. They were the ones, trading in people, not degular Western Europeans. But, that is the game that they have played this whole entire time. They pretended to be ancient Hebrews, and then they cosplay as just regular old white people, but really they're secretive, plotting, scheming MFers who they're obviously the children of Satan, and they practice witchcraft, which is Kabbalah, and it goes back to ancient times, dude. So this enemy that we have is more subtle and craftier than anything. And nobody realizes it. And then more than half of America, thinks they're God's chosen people. It makes me nauseous. Anyways. Okay, let's see. The commerce of Western Europe was largely in Jewish hands, not excluding the slave trade, and the Carolingian Carcelaries Jew and merchant are used as most interchangeable terms. But with the growth of a native mercantile class, they began gradually excluded not only from most productive occupations, but also from the traditional forms of commerce, and virtually the only field left open to them was lending capital on interest. End quote. The floating wealth of the country was soaked up by Jews. Did you hear that? The floating wealth of the country was soaked up by Jews. This has happened over and over and over again. There's a reason why they were kicked out of 109 countries and counting. And it's not because people are jealous because they're God's chosen. You cannot serve God and mammon. So, anyways, the floating wealth of the country was soaked up by the Jews, who were periodically made to disgorge into the exchequer. End quote. The archetype of Shylock was established long before Shakespeare's time. In the honeymoon days, Charlemagne had sent a historic embassy in 797 to Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad to negotiate a treaty of friendship. The embassy was composed of the Jew Isaac and 2 Christian nobles. The bitter end came when in 1306, Philip le Bel expelled the Jews from the Kingdom of France. Though later some were allowed to return, they suffered further persecution, and by the end of the century, the French community of Jews was virtually extinct. The modern community of Jews in France and England was founded by refugees from the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th and 17th centuries. So they're literally sucking all the wealth out of the country, subverting the cultures, and then wondering why they're victims. And why did we get kicked out? It's because you're shitty fucking people. That's why. All right, section 3. I'm going to try to get done with section 3, upload this, and then do another one before I have to go meet my patty cakes. Section 3. If we turn to the history of German Jewry, the first fact to note is that, quote, remarkably, we do not possess a comprehensive scholarly history of German Jewry. The Germanica Judaica is merely a good reference work to historic sources shedding light on individual communities up to 1238. End quote. It is a dim light, but at least it illuminates the territorial distribution of the Western Jewish communities in Germany during the critical period when Khazar Jewish immigration into Poland was approaching its peak. And this is not accidental. They don't want their shitty evil deeds being recorded down for history, okay? And the fact that they are rich beyond measure because of usury, money is power. So, I mean, but you have to have some discernment. People are not just going to come out and tell you this. You have to be able to have discernment and detect the BS. And that's what I'm here to help you do, friends. Okay. One of the earliest records of such a community in Germany mentions a certain Calonimus who in 906 emigrated with his kinsfolk from Lucca in Italy to Mayence. About the same time, we hear of Jews in Spires and Worms, and somewhat later in other places, Treves, Metz, Strasbourg, Cologne, all of them situated in a narrow strip in Alsace or Alsace, I don't know, along the Rhone Valley. It's Rhone, right? R-R-H-I-N-E. It's not Rhine. I thought it was pronounced Rhone. Anyways, I could be wrong. Whatever. I'm not good at some foreign pronunciations. I pronounced orgeat or orgeat or something the other day at work. It's like an almond syrup for like making drinks. Anyways, okay. The Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela visited the region in the middle of the 12th century and wrote, quote, in these cities there are many Israelites. They're not Israelites, bro. They're Khazarians. Wise, rich men, end quote. But how many are, quote, many? In fact, very few, as will be seen. See, they're lying fucking liars. That's all they do. If their mouths are moving, they are lying. Earlier on, there lived in Mayence a certain Rabbi Gershom ben Yehuda, which I'm sure his name was something like Milkowski, like Satan Yahoo, okay, whose great learning earned him the title, the, quote, light of the diaspora, end quote, and the position of spiritual head of the French and Rhenish German community. At some date around 1020, Gershom convened a rabbinical council in Worms, which issued various edicts, including one that put a legal stop to polygamy, which had anyway been in abeyance for a long time. To these edicts, a codicil was added, which provided that in case of urgency, any regulation could be revoked, quote, by an assembly of 100 delegates from the countries Burgundy, Normandy, France, and the towns of Mayence, Spires, and Worms, end quote. In other rabbinical documents, too, dating from the same period, only these 3 towns are named, and we can only conclude that the other Jewish communities in the Rhineland were, in the beginning of the 11th century, still too insignificant to be mentioned. By the end of the same century, the Jewish communities of Germany narrowly escaped complete extermination in the outbursts of mob hysteria accompanying the First Crusade, AD 1096. F. Barker has conveyed the Crusaders' mentality with a dramatic force rarely encountered in the columns of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He might butcher all till he waded ankle deep in blood, and then at nightfall kneel, sobbing for very joy, at the altar of the sepulchre, for he was not read from the winepress of was he not read from the winepress of the Lord. I mean, you're supposed to like get rid of the evil wherever you find it, right? And Christians need to literally like grow a spine, okay? Like this whole the King James has like made Christians weak slave-minded government worshipers. Okay? And that's not what we're commanded to be, okay? We got to wake up, people, before it's too late, because they are literally trying to unalive us all. The jays of the Rhineland were caught in that winepress, which nearly squeezed them to death. Moreover, they themselves became affected by a different type of mass hysteria, a morbid yearning for martyrdom. According to the, quote, Hebrew, and I'm putting that in quotes because I doubt this motherfucker's Hebrew at all, chronicler Solomon Bar Simon, considered as generally reliable, the Jews of Mayence, faced with the alternative between baptism or death in the hands of the mob, gave the example to other communities by deciding on collective suicide. Imitating on a grand scale Abraham's readiness to sacrifice Isaac, oh my God, spare me. Spare me. Fathers slaughtered their children and husbands their wives. These acts of unspeakable horror and heroism were performed in the ritualistic form of slaughter with sacrificial knives sharpened in accordance with Jewish law. See, these people are human sacrificers. Okay? This whole, we had to either convert to Christianity or whatever, or be killed. Like, bro, give me a break, okay? I think we can see from the Byzantium method of like diplomacy, that's how most Christians and people act like the Crusades. I've got to do some more research on the Crusades, but I know that like what the main story that they tell us about the Crusades is utter bullshit. I know that much. And also, you got to remember, history is mostly written and published by the Jays also. So, take everything with a grain. So they literally sacrificed their families. Like, wow. At times, the leading sages of the community supervising the mass immolation were the last to part with life at their own hands. In the mass hysteria, sanctified by the glow of religious martyrdom and compensated by the confident expectation of heavenly rewards, nothing seemed to matter but to end life before one fell into the hands of the implacable foes and had to face the inescapable alternative of death at the enemy's hands or conversion to Christianity. Wow. Turning from gore to sober statistics, we get a rough idea of the size of the Jewish communities in Germany. The quote, Hebrew, I wish they'd stop calling it Hebrew. They're Jewish. They're not Hebrew at all. Sources agree on 800 victims by slaughter or suicide in Worms and vary between 900 and 1,300 for Mayence. Of course, there must have been many who preferred baptism to death, and the sources do not indicate the number of survivors, nor can we be sure that they do not exaggerate in the number of martyrs. At any rate, Barron concludes from his calculations that, quote, the total of Jewish population of either community had hardly exceeded the figures were here given for the dead alone. So they're always trying to hype up the numbers, in other words. So the survivors in Worms or in Mayence can only have numbered a few hundred in each case, yet the 2 towns, with Spires as a third, were the only ones important enough to be included in Rabbi Gersham's edict earlier on. Thus, we are made to realize that the Jewish community in the German Rhineland was numerically small even before the First Crusade, and had shrunk to even smaller proportions after having gone through the winepress of the Lord. Yet, cast of the Rhine in general and northern Germany, there were as yet no Jewish communities at all, and none for a long time to come. This traditional concept of Jewish historians that the Crusade of 1096 swept like a broom a mass migration of German Jews into Poland is simply a legend, or rather an ad hoc hypothesis invented because they knew little of Khazar history. They could see no other way to account for their emergence out of nowhere of this unprecedented concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe. Yet there is not a single mention in the contemporary sources of any migration, large or small, from the Rhineland further east into Germany, not to mention distant Poland. Of course not. Thus, Simon Dubnov, one of the historians of the older school, quote, "The First Crusade, which set the Christian masses in motion towards the Asiatic East, drove at the same time the Jewish masses towards the cast of Europe," end quote. However, a few lines further down, he has to admit, quote, "About the circumstances of this immigration movement, which was so important to Jewish history, we possess no close information." Yeah, it's so important they didn't even write it down, because they have changed history. They've made shit up. Like, this is so sus, and nobody seems to have a problem with it. But yet, they're God's chosen, and we just need to give them Palestine and let them unalive everyone and Sheminicide everybody because, the Bible. It's so stupid. It's such BS. Okay. Okay. So, we do possess abundant information on what these battered Jewish communities did during the first and subsequent crusades. Some died by their own hands, others tried to offer resistance and were lynched, while those who survived owed their good fortune to the fact that they were given shelter for the duration of the emergency in the fortified castle of the bishop or burgrave, who at least theoretically was responsible for their legal protection. Frequently, this measure was not enough to prevent a massacre, but the survivors, once the crusading hordes had passed, invariably returned to their ransacked homes and synagogues to make a fresh start. We find this pattern repeatedly in chronicles. In Treves, in Metz, and many other places, by the time of the Second and later Crusades, had become almost a routine. Quote, "At the beginning of the agitation for a new crusade, many Jews of Mayence, Worms, Spires, Strasbourg, Warburg, or Würzburg, and other cities escaped to neighboring castles, leaving their books and precious possessions in the custody of friendly burghers." End quote. One of the main sources is the Book of Remembrance by Ephraim Bar Jacob, who himself at the age of 13 had been among the refugees from Cologne and the castle of Volkenberg. Solomon Bar Simon reports that during the Second Crusade, the survivors of the Mayence Jews found protection in Spires, then returned to their native city and built a new synagogue. This is the leitmotif of the Chronicles. To repeat it once more, there is not a word about Jewish communities emigrating toward Eastern Germany, which, in the word of Mises, was still Judenrein, clean of Jews, and was to remain so for several centuries. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to upload, and then I'm going to try to read a little bit more.